Hello, my name is Kristen. Welcome to my floor in my room where I talk to my camera. Today, I'm going to be talking about Berlin because I lived there for 4 months as a Minerva school student. So if you don't know about Minerva, you might want to check it out. But today I'm going to be just focusing on what I really took away from my time living in Berlin, what I really learned from being in that environment. I've been doing this for all of the Minerva cities. If you want to see the others, that'll also be linked wherever. Today I'm going to tell you the 5 things, that I learned from living in Berlin. The first thing I learned is that xenophobia is super freaking real. Because, crazy enough, I, even as a white person, experienced some amount of it in Berlin because there's an attitude right now amongst some people, not amongst everyone, in Germany because of the refugee situation that there is a lot of hatred towards people that don't speak German by certain individuals in the population. And that was kind of crazy to me. I think people kind of idolize Europe, at least in America, and the main thing about Europe that's like so cool is that it's like, oh, everyone speaks so many languages and they all like love each other. All of the other Europeans. I don't know. That was like the thing that I had in my imagination for some reason. And that bubble was definitely burst because I think this mainly happened like on the subway or public transportation. There would be like yelling at people who were specifically not speaking German. I think I experienced it myself maybe only once, but I heard about it, other people having this issue, and it was just crazy to me. I guess I feel like when I think about xenophobia in America, a lot of it is like contexts that I'm separate from. So like the idea of policy, Trump, all of that. And it was just strange to have it like happen right in front of me and like somewhat directed at me. Second, I learned that cities actually really can be super bike friendly and actually have an infrastructure where it almost seems more normal to bike than it necessarily is to drive. So that was crazy. There's a few reasons Berlin is so great for bikes. One big one is just nature happenstance. Berlin is super flat, so that just makes it easier to bike. Like, even if San Francisco tried to be super bike friendly, those hills would discourage a lot of people. But also, a lot of it is infrastructure. There are bike lanes everywhere. The norm for drivers is to respect bikers as part of traffic and not as like an intrusion into traffic. So this made me wonder, why are other cities, particularly in the US, so bad at encouraging people to bike? I don't really have an answer. I have like a couple of speculations. One is that capitalism, because you make a lot less money off of people who are buying bikes and repairing bikes than people who are buying cars, buying gas, and repairing cars. Just a thought. Also, a big problem in America, at least, is that the way suburbs developed in like the 50s and 60s is a lot different to the background, the history of these European cities. Because in Berlin, at least, there used to be a whole bunch of towns, which eventually all grew into each other. But this means there's a lot of sort of like town center, downtown type of places all around Berlin. And this means it's really easy to actually live your life within a smaller area most of the time. It's not quite like that in America because when suburbs grew out, it was almost exclusively housing, just as many individual houses as you could get. So it's also not as dense, so it's harder to have people close to things. Because it was mainly just expanding housing, most people living in the suburbs couldn't live their entire life within like a 5-mile radius. Obviously, you can bike more than 5 miles. I think it's a lot easier to bike when things are close, or at least when it also feels like normal. So I feel like those two things kind of work together to make biking super not a thing in the US. But again, that's just speculation. Third, I thought a lot about the remembrance culture in Berlin and in Germany and how powerful that really is, because it gives a completely different perspective to past wrongs than we have in the US. So in Berlin, there are tons of memorials that are super respected. There's a lot of intention around how you interact with those memorials as well that makes it feel like there's a lot of honor towards people who have suffered in the past. And particularly people who have suffered at the hands of Germans in the past. Obviously, World War II, Nazis, huge thing. The memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin was actually only put up, I think 20 years ago. I'll look it up. Year here. Kind of recently. And that really shows that even though a generation has passed, a lot of Germans today don't have a direct connection to those events. They still feel the need to remember them. And that remembrance is how they ensure things don't get repeated and also maintain good relations with the people who are descended from the ones that did suffer and who do feel those repercussions a lot more in their daily life. The interesting thing about this is that it is absolutely not how the US deals with slavery. I feel if the US did deal with slavery with more of that kind of attitude, it would vastly improve the state of things. And it doesn't even require you to really accept any amount of culpability, because that's the argument I hear a lot from white people about slavery is like, oh, I didn't do it, I'm not responsible. But I'm sorry, my SD card, my memory card in my camera was just full, so I had to pick it up and delete something because I'm irresponsible. So if the angle is slightly different, I am sorry. I also have lost my train of thought, but let's go for it. Yes, okay, so Americans, a lot of white Americans don't want to feel like they have to take responsibility for what happened in the past. And I feel like remembrance is a little bit different, and it doesn't really require the same amount of culpability that people seem to be saying they don't want to have, which I think is fair. Like, you didn't do it, but you have to respect that the repercussions of it are still affecting your life. And I think that is present in Germany. I'm not going to get into it too much more because I don't know if it's my place to rant about it. I'm just saying I really liked the perspective that Berlin's remembrance culture gave on dealing with past wrongs. Let's move on to 4, which is that gentrification is inevitable. If you don't know what gentrification is, I'm going to try and give a quick rundown, but I'll probably also link a video that explains it better than me. Basically, gentrification is the process whereby a neighborhood which is mostly poor, often mostly not white, becomes hip, and eventually rent rises, and all of those people who originally lived there are no longer able to afford rent, and they get kicked out and replaced with young professionals, basically, who want to be in the hip area and who can afford the rent. The reason it becomes hip is usually because, since it's so cheap, artists will live there because artists don't have a lot of money, and eventually that art culture makes it a cool place to be, and then there's a increased demand for the housing, and eventually prices rise, and then there's a turnaround basically in who lives there, and it sort of destroys the original community. Hopefully that was a decent rundown. But so, this has been happening constantly, ongoingly, in different neighborhoods in Berlin. Certain neighborhoods are like fully gentrified. It happened really fast in certain areas, especially the parts of Berlin that used to be East Berlin. When Berlin unified, a lot of people left that area, and then it became a poor area where people who couldn't really afford much lived, even some squatters. Hence, the process began, but because it was like very close to the center, as Berlin started to like get back on its feet, there was a growing demand for housing. Completely gentrified. The area I lived in, Kreuzberg, I'm sorry if I said that weird, is in the process of being gentrified and was actually fighting it in a lot of ways. So I got to actually talk to someone who has been fighting against gentrification in like a community center. That was super interesting to hear him talk about it, because it's like you can slow down these processes by resisting, by helping tenants to stand up for their rights, because sometimes the turnover does happen in a somewhat shady way because landlords are trying to make make the more money that they could be making, and so they're getting the original tenants out in less than legitimate ways in some cases. You can slow it down, you can resist it, you can build that community strength. And for example, Kreuzberg also stopped Google from opening a campus there while I was in Berlin last fall, but it's like Google just said they wouldn't come for the next 5 years, and they're probably still gonna come eventually. So it's kind of this like inevitable process that feels really destructive for the initial community. And in this case with Kreuzberg, it's also important because that's largely an immigrant community. It's largely a Turkish immigrant community, and other like refugees that feel comfortable in that sort of environment are also therefore moving into the area. But so there's a lot of resources like doctors that are in that area specifically that speak those languages, and so when these people get kicked out, it gets a lot harder for them to access those services when they don't speak German. Basically, the reason it happens is capitalism, because it's all about supply and demand and the landlords wanting to make more money, which is fair because that's what capitalism encourages. And basically I hate it. That's my whole thought. I really didn't like the hopelessness and sadness I saw in the original community, and it does seem kind of unnecessary for people to be driving up the demand for rent in that area. It seems like individual consumers could be making the decision not to try and move into these areas just because they're like hip art scenes. I feel like people just don't realize how their individual actions affect others. So big takeaway was that I do want to consider those sorts of things when I am apartment hunting, house hunting, whatever, when I'm trying to decide where I want to live. This is the kind of thing I don't want to feel like I personally contributed to. This takes us to number 5, which is also about capitalism, but specifically the idea of graffiti and how much of a crime it really is. In Berlin, it is not nearly as bad of a criminal repercussion if you're caught doing graffiti as it is in most places in the US. Because of that, the graffiti in Berlin is a lot better in terms of aesthetics. There's a lot more cool pieces, a lot more beautiful pieces, and it feels like a contribution to the urban landscape as opposed to scribbles, because when people are afraid of getting caught, they still do it, but they spend less time doing it to diminish the chances that they will be caught doing it, which is why graffiti in the US has just gotten uglier. Basically, I loved it in Berlin. I loved how much graffiti there was. I thought that it really gave character to the city. And there is a fine, obviously. There can be pretty massive fines if you get caught doing it, but it's not like you're gonna go in jail for several years, which is the case in the US a lot of the time, I believe. But so, I really liked the way it was in Berlin also because it sort of de-emphasizes private property, because the reason graffiti is such a crime is because of strong capitalist beliefs that individuals own their property and have complete control over it. Whereas if you regard property or spaces as publicly owned and part of a collective ownership, then individuals do have the right to paint those places. I feel like that might be some indication that some of the leftover attitudes of when East Germany was communist might have lessened their opinion on this particular thing. That's speculation, but I did appreciate that it felt more like our walls as opposed to the total separation of capitalism, but that's just because clearly I'm not a fan of capitalism. And I just want to throw in a bonus number 6 that obviously I thought about the wall a lot. I thought about how Berlin was split in half a lot, but I don't really have a takeaway from that besides oh my god, it's crazy that this place was literally split in half right there, and one side was under ultimate observation control and the other side was very barren. A lot of the punk scene developed in Berlin because West Berlin wasn't a super fun place to be because you were just surrounded by the communism, and the main reason to live there is because you could get out of mandatory service if you moved to West Berlin, because West Germany had mandatory military service going on. So mostly the people there were people who didn't want to go into the military. And I was just that's wild. Bonus number 6. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of the things I talked about. Obviously, my thoughts are not fully formed. These are just sort of like things that Berlin prompted me to think about and to start having thoughts about. But if you want to contribute, please do so below. Yeah, that's all. Berlin was fun. I had a lot of thoughts. Thank you for listening to my thoughts. This is the end screen now. Thank you for watching. You should definitely like subscribe, and you should like watch this video. I don't know where I'm pointing. Also, you should follow me on social media. I have been tweeting a lot more recently. I don't really post it on Instagram though because I'm not a real influencer. Okay, thanks, bye! I'm totally stealing that "Okay, thanks, bye" from Tiffany Ferg, by the way, but like, I hate outros.